These terrorists escorted 5 hostages to the beach. They were about to carry out a live execution, but they had no idea that many snipers were already lying in ambush around them. Everyone was ready for action. Among them were sharpshooter Brandon Beckett and his mentor named Chuck Miller. Meanwhile, Colonel Jackson was also in a remote command room, overseeing the entire operation. Based on the footage recorded by the drone, the colonel confirmed that the hostages were all Americans and immediately gave the order to open fire. Miller assigned the critical first shot to Brandon. However, just as Brandon locked onto the target and was about to pull the trigger, he suddenly noticed the terrorists handing a knife to a young boy. At that moment, he clearly showed a conflicted expression. No matter what, he couldn't bring himself to shoot a child. Seeing the combat window slipping away, Miller kept urging him, and the team started speaking up one by one. The boy was gripping the knife tightly, and it looked like the hostage would be beheaded in the next second. But Brandon still couldn't pull the trigger. In a helpless situation, Miller had no choice but to change the order and assign someone else to shoot. However, the boy suddenly threw the knife away, coincidentally avoiding a fatal bullet. The gunshot terrified all the terrorists. One of them raised a knife and brutally slashed the hostage's throat, causing him to pass away. This time, the colonel could no longer stay still. He immediately deployed 2 armed helicopters to the battlefield. Brandon and the others also turned toward the scattering terrorists, firing continuously. With coordinated attacks from both air and ground, the terrorists were instantly overwhelmed and fled in panic. At the same time, the drone fired a missile that tracked its target. The last 2 terrorists were blown to bits in a loud explosion. However, even though they had won the battle, Brandon was filled with guilt and sorrow. But they could have completed the mission far better. Yet because of him, they almost made a huge mistake, and it led to the loss of an innocent hostage. Such a mistake was something even Miller couldn't accept. He stood in front of Brandon and sternly warned him, "As a sniper, you must never hesitate under any circumstances." But Brandon had no idea that a much greater danger was now targeting him. After the mission ended, Brandon and his team went to Istanbul to relax. He suddenly noticed a blonde woman with a graceful figure. Just then, the woman turned her head around. Their eyes met, and Brandon felt as if his soul was being drawn away. But the woman seemed to tease him on purpose, saying nothing and walking off into the distance. So, how could Brandon hold back any longer? His body moved on its own and followed her. The 2 of them, one ahead and one behind, quickly reached the seashore. However, just as Brandon was imagining what might happen next, his head was suddenly locked in the crosshairs by an assassin lurking in the shadows. Just as the assassin was about to pull the trigger, a man suddenly shot him down. It was Brandon's former superior, named Peter Miller. After confirming the assassin had passed away, Peter called Brandon. He asked to meet him nearby. After the call ended, Brandon turned around and realized he was alone. This made him even more curious about the mysterious woman. Not long after, Peter met with Brandon. He didn't waste time on small talk and went straight to the point to warn Brandon. Because of the last operation, the terrorists had put a $150,000 bounty on his head. So, he needed to be especially careful these days. At the same time, Peter had also learned about Brandon's mistake on the battlefield. He sternly warned as a sniper, "You cannot act on emotion. Otherwise, one day your own conscience will get you killed." However, Peter didn't come this time just to say those things. He brought Brandon's team on a boat to meet the colonel. Now that their short break was over, their next mission awaited them. But this time, the orders came from someone else. As soon as the words ended, a familiar voice echoed. Brandon turned around and saw the beautiful blonde woman from earlier striding toward him. Turns out she was Robin Slater, commander of the Civil Military Cooperation Center. Robin didn't waste any words and briefly introduced the current mission. They had to go to Georgia to coordinate with local soldiers, to escort energy tycoon Kalian for an oil pipeline inspection. And he was the target of the armed group leader Gazakop. Gazakop had military training in the past, so Robin would deploy drones for aerial reconnaissance to assist the soldiers in locating the enemy. After saying goodbye to Peter, Brandon's team immediately set off, flying by helicopter to Russia. By then, Kalian's convoy had already departed. Everyone spread out along the road, watching every slight movement, even swaying grass. Robin also deployed a drone to patrol overhead. The defense system seemed airtight, but they had no idea Gazakop and his men had been waiting for a long time. They even prepared heavy anti-material sniper rifles with extreme power. The moment Ann Crew's vehicle appeared, there was a sharp whooshing sound. That terrifying sniper bullet immediately pierced through the bulletproof glass, went through the bodyguard in the front seat, and struck Ann Crew directly. The car spun wildly before crashing to the ground. This sudden attack caught everyone completely off guard. They scrambled to locate the terrorists. However, their positions had already been locked in by Gazakop. As soon as he pulled the trigger, a sniper was instantly killed on the spot. At that moment, the scene turned completely chaotic. The Georgian soldiers and terrorists began a fierce firefight. However, Brandon and his team still couldn't locate Gazakop's position. Miller was so anxious that he paced back and forth like a cat on a hot tin roof. But that didn't help at all. Soon after, Gazakop once again spotted and took down another sniper. Luckily, the drone locked onto his position. The colonel immediately gave the order to launch a missile. A loud explosion was heard. Boom! Flames erupted violently, instantly engulfing 3 terrorists. Everyone scrambled, rushing to evacuate the barely breathing Anne crew. Brandon quickly ran over to check on his teammates' condition, but unfortunately, it was already too late. Back at the camp, Brandon was filled with both sorrow and doubt. He couldn't understand why his teammates had camouflaged so well. Yet Gazakop was still able to pinpoint their exact positions. And what was even stranger was that after the battle ended, all the Russian soldiers remained completely unharmed. Only his team had lost 2 men. Brandon didn't believe that Gazakop could see through a sniper's camouflage with just a glance. Nor did he believe such casualties were merely coincidence. So, there was only one possible explanation for this situation. There had to be a mole in the Russian army. Upon hearing this blunt accusation, the Georgian officer's face immediately turned grim. Right after, he got into a heated argument with Brandon. Fortunately, Miller intervened just in time, preventing the situation from getting worse. To punish Brandon for his impulsiveness and recklessness, the colonel reassigned him to the Greater Caucasus Mountains to protect the oil pipeline. Guided by the observer Saeed, Brandon crossed snowy peaks to reach the outpost. However, right upon arrival, the soldiers inside gave Brandon hostile looks. They stood up, ready to teach the new guy a lesson. But this time, they messed with the wrong guy. Brandon blocked a strong punch, countered, and took one down. Then he dodged a knife strike and knocked out another, and then stabbed his dagger into the support beam. This entire scene was watched by Zaido, hidden in the shadows. Once Brandon drew his gun and gained control of the situation, Zaido calmly stepped out. He already knew why Brandon had been sent there, and reminded Brandon that, next time, don't be so quick to accuse others without solid evidence, especially high-ranking officers. However, Zaido greatly admired Brandon's bravery. He firmly believed that Brandon would be able to uncover the truth. So Zaido offered a method on his own. The best way to investigate was to strike at the root of the issue. Why not go ask the terrorists directly? How did they manage to spot the snipers? That question, though it sounded crazy, made Brandon stop and think. Not long after that, Brandon's team set out on another patrol. They happened to discover a few local soldiers stealing from outpost number 2. Zaido didn't want to talk. He aimed to shoot them on the spot. But Brandon stopped him. Brandon believed that, even though they stole, their crime wasn't worth death. Hearing this, Zaido didn't argue back, and let Brandon try it his way. Following orders, Brandon armed himself and headed down. Soon after, he subdued 4 of the soldiers. However, just as Brandon thought it was all over, the woman in front of him suddenly raised her gun. Fortunately, Zaido shot her just in time. The rest of the team rushed in and took out the remaining 3 in an instant. At the same time, they captured the last soldier alive. This incident taught Brandon yet another lesson. It helped him realize that not everyone is worth saving. That night, Miller contacted Brandon with some bad news. The person killed by the drone wasn't Gazakop, but his brother-in-law. In addition, Miller had thoroughly investigated the Russian officer's background, but found nothing suspicious at all. It seemed Brandon's accusation had been false. But the danger wasn't over yet. The next day, a group of Chechen soldiers crossed the snowy mountains and headed straight for the outpost. Clearly, they came to avenge their comrades. Once everyone got the news, they quickly began preparing for battle. They smashed the windows to get a clearer view and flipped tables and chairs for cover. Brandon and Saeed went outside to set up an ambush. Time kept passing slowly, and Saeed grew increasingly anxious. He couldn't understand why the Chechens hadn't launched their attack yet. However, Brandon knew this was just the calm before the storm. Sure enough, a sniper silently peeked out from the mountainside and precisely shot the soldier in the watchtower. Brandon tracked the bullet's path, spotted the enemy's shadow, and quickly retaliated, taking him down. The gunfire acted as a signal within seconds. Many shooters stormed out of the forest. The battle officially erupted. In the chaos, Brandon realized an RPG had locked onto him. He quickly rolled to the side. Even so, the shockwave from the explosion blasted him away. His body spun out of control, rolling downhill. Luckily, he was stopped by a tree branch on the slope. Brandon endured the pain and reassembled his gun. He noticed the terrorists had already breached the outpost. They captured Zaitov inside and were about to execute him. What shocked him even more was that the cowardly Saeed chose to surrender. He voluntarily revealed Brandon's hiding place. As a terrorist raised his axe, Brandon pulled the trigger, and the bullet pierced his head. Right after, he turned his gun and shot both the enemy and Saeed. Under Brandon's precise firepower, the remaining terrorists were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Wherever he aimed, they fell one after another. The last one quickly grabbed Zaitov as a hostage, trying to force Brandon to surrender. But by now, Brandon's mindset had changed. He no longer hesitated. He locked onto the enemy and decisively pulled the trigger, saving Zaitov just in time. The entire scene was watched by the colonel through the drone's camera. He smiled with satisfaction, knowing Brandon had transformed, and ordered him back to the battlefield. However, Brandon didn't immediately return to the unit, but followed Zaitov's instructions, and went to another camp to meet Zaitov's friend. Zaitov is GA, and GA has wide connections. He could lead Brandon to meet Gazakop and help him find the answers he was seeking. But when the two met, Brandon found out that GA was blind. He couldn't help but feel uneasy, worried about the journey ahead. But GA quickly demonstrated his professionalism. He already knew everything from Zaitov, and had even retrieved the body of his brother-in-law, Jacob. This made Brandon look at GA in a new light. Early the next morning, the two of them helped each other into Gazakov's territory. Their movement was quickly detected by a military drone. At the same time, it caught the attention of Gazakov's men. As the ambushing terrorists appeared one by one from the forest, Brandon immediately became highly alert. Sensing Brandon's tension, GA reassured him and brought out the body case. According to Islamic tradition, Gazakov needed his brother-in-law's body for the funeral. Brandon took this opportunity to ask how they discovered the sniper's coordinates. But the terrorists claimed it was a gift from Allah. Brandon believed that was complete nonsense, and bluntly said they were lying. Upon hearing this, Gazakov, who was sitting in the crowd, could no longer stay silent. He growled, saying he never lies. He told Brandon that, because he had brought his brother-in-law's body, he would keep his promise and spare his life. However, Brandon's attention wasn't on Gazakov. He noticed a terrorist fiddling with a military laptop and tracking a missile incoming from a drone. Hearing the warning alarm, everyone scattered. Brandon and GA were blasted down the hillside by the shockwave. Luckily, neither of them was seriously hurt. When they returned to the main pumping station of the pipeline, Robin exploded with rage over their reckless act. But Brandon didn't care at all, because he had discovered the root of the problem. There really was no mole in the Russian army. The reason Gazakov could pinpoint the sniper's coordinates was because they had hacked into the military drone. But Robin rejected this explanation. She didn't believe those barbaric terrorists could crack military tech. At that moment, the colonel called Brandon and Miller, angrily questioning them. Brandon took the chance to share his theory and told him that now someone on the black market was selling login credentials to the U.S. military system. However, the colonel still believed it was nonsense and ordered Miller to manage his men properly. Soon after, the drone located Gazakov's position. A team of Georgian soldiers was immediately dispatched there. Brandon and his teammates secretly provided backup from a distance. However, what no one knew was that this so-called intel was actually just a ruse created by the terrorists. They had indeed hacked the drone and obtained the coordinates of all the snipers. As soon as the troops arrived, Gazakov suddenly launched an attack. Moreover, since he was in a blind spot, Brandon's team couldn't lock onto the target. Thus, the battle turned into a one-sided massacre. After eliminating the Georgian soldiers, Gazakov acted like he was taking roll call. He aimed at a sniper, pulled the trigger, and wounded him. He even nearly shot Miller, who was lying on the mountaintop. At this point, Brandon was fully convinced of his theory. He urgently ordered everyone to remove their GPS-equipped tactical vests. But Gazakov had already achieved his goal. Seeing reinforcements arriving, he carried his gun and fled. By the time Brandon and the others stormed the building, it was completely empty inside. This battle made Miller fully believe Brandon's words. He told Robin that the drone really had been hacked. However, Robin still stubbornly refused to believe it. Not long after, the colonel arrived at the main pumping station and handed Miller and the others a photo. The photo clearly showed that Gazakov had started moving, preparing to attack the gas compression station in South Georgia. So the colonel ordered the sniper team to go there immediately to stop him, even though Miller thought this wasn't a good idea. Orders are orders, so he had no choice but to lead his team on the mission. This time, however, everyone was more cautious. No one activated the GPS device on their body. On the way, Brandon asked who had discovered that Gazakov was on the move. When he learned it was from the drone, he became even more worried. He asked Miller in return, why would Gazakov ignore the main pumping station, which controls 900 kilometers of pipeline, and instead attack an unimportant gas compression station? That question left Miller speechless. He couldn't understand it either. Brandon took the chance to share his thoughts. Gazakov's real target was never the gas compression station. He did it to lure us away. Hearing this, Miller was deeply alarmed. He decided to trust Brandon once more. He immediately ordered the convoy to turn around. It turned out Brandon was right. The so-called attack on the gas compression station really was a diversion. Gazakov's men had infiltrated the drone and altered the data to create false intel about his movement, pulling off a complete bait and switch. Their real target was the main pumping station, which now had no defensive troops. By now, they had seen the sniper team leave and put on their masks, ready to attack. At the same time, the colonel also started doubting the drone's security. He asked Robin if there was even a 1% chance the terrorists could have hacked the system. But Robin firmly insisted it was impossible. However, before she could finish her sentence, a shell exploded. Immediately after, the terrorists launched a fierce attack. Being slapped in the face like that, Robin finally believed Brandon. She quickly alerted headquarters and ordered all drones in the air to return. But it was too little, too late. The main pumping station already had weak defenses, and slow response on top of that, so it didn't take long for the terrorists to breach the main gate. The colonel had no choice but to take up arms. Just as everyone was struggling to hold on, the sniper team finally returned. They mounted their rifles behind the battlefield, targeting the terrorists with no cover. Seeing this, Gazakop knew the real fight had arrived. He immediately ordered the spotter to locate their position. But by then, the drone had already been withdrawn. They no longer had any advantage. Soon after, Brandon locked onto Gazakop's position. He pulled the trigger and accurately shot the spotter. At that moment, Gazakop completely panicked. He grabbed his weapon and ran desperately forward. Reaching a bush, he used his arm as a brace, aimed and fired, injuring Brandon's spotter. Fortunately, after going through previous battles, Brandon had become much more composed. He held his breath and focused intensely on the bushes. Finally, he caught the glint reflecting off Gazakop's scope. Immediately, Brandon pulled the trigger without hesitation. The bullet tore across the battlefield and finished off Gazakop. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining terrorists panicked and fled to their vehicles. Everything finally came to an end. Brandon, with his intelligence and sharpshooting skills, once again diffused a deadly crisis. Miller kept praising him. He knew that Brandon had not disgraced his father's name. Robin also took the initiative to apologize for her previous stubbornness. However, Brandon no longer cared about any of that, because he had to be ready for the next danger. Six Sniper Shooter is a war film released in 2016. If I had to rate this movie on a 5-star scale, I'd give the action scenes 3.5 stars, as the third installment in the Sniper series. The gunfight scenes are quite satisfying, highlighting the brutality of war and the terror of snipers, which makes the audience feel very thrilled. As for the plot, I'd give it 2 stars. The storyline is generally complete, but its biggest flaw is definitely the scene where Brandon meets Gazakop to talk. What's even more illogical is that Gazakop let him leave. They really are worthy rivals. Do you think this scene makes sense? Leave a comment below so we can discuss it. If there's another movie you'd like to see, comment the title below too. The value of a movie lies in its reputation, but the value of a movie review lies in its feelings. That's it for today's story. Thanks for watching. What did you think of this movie? Comment down below.